Hello, welcome to Book Talk. This is your host, Anthony Moirore. At Book Talk, we get to have an author come and tell us about his book or her book. And today we have a great guest with us, and we are going to be discussing a book she's written known as Your Resonant Self Workbook. And I won't take one extra minute because we've got a lot to cover with her. I'm just going to introduce to the show our guest today, who is known as Sarah Peyton. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, and we are honored to have you here on our show. And we are ready to hear what the book is all about. But before we get to hear about the book, we'd like to know a little about yourself. Where are you from? And what do you do?
I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska.
Alaska, the coldest
Yes,
on the planet.
70 miles south of the Arctic Circle. So it
Okay.
was an odd place to grow up, and it was a place where people would come to get away from their families and to get
Mm,
away from their trauma. Of course, we carry our trauma in our brain, so we can't actually get away from it. But I think many people who came to Fairbanks in the 1960s were really wanting a full clean break from family.
mm-hmm,
And and my parents were two of those who I think really appreciated having some space to breathe away from their families of origin. And in 1960s in Alaska, you know, phone calls were very expensive and nobody
yeah.
came to visit, for an afternoon. So it was quite an interesting place to grow up in terms of trauma and becoming a trauma healer.
And when you talk of trauma and what kind of experiences did you have growing up?
Oh, well, it was very confusing when I was growing up. My mother was really unpredictable, and I always thought it was me until I was in, I think, my 30s. And my brother and I realized that my mom had dissociative identity disorder. So
Mhm.
then, because which means that there are different parts of you that come forward to take care of different things. So my mom had a conflict part that would come forward and then immediately disappear. So if you had a conflict with her, she wouldn't remember it 2 minutes later. So
Mm,
she just kind of stayed the same because there was no way to integrate any feedback. But what was so interesting was that then just I'm almost 60, about 2 years ago, my cousin gave me a newspaper clipping that was the divorce proceedings from my grandmother, my mother's mother. It had my grandmother talking to the judge about the night that my mother's father tried to kill them both
mm,
before my mother was 3 years old, which is that's the kind of trauma that creates the fracturing that I grew up with. So there we are. It's like my life was a riddle of what the heck is going on with emotional trauma. I didn't know that I was becoming an expert in, in emotional trauma, but I had a childhood that completely set me up to come into the world and explore emotional trauma because it was so mysterious.
mm-hmm. And where are you located right now? Because you're not in Alaska at the moment.
No, I'm very to Portland, Oregon, in Vancouver, Washington, in the United States.
Oh, that's beautiful. And slowly by slowly, you kind of identified what you're meant to be helping the people with. And at what point did you just know that yes, this is really me, and this is what I ought to be?
Um, Two things. One is that I was volunteering teaching communication at a women's prison south of Portland, Oregon,
Mm-hmm.
and and I was trying to teach nonviolent communication, talking to them about the brain and about relational neuroscience and about the impact of trauma, and that was what really lit them up, and that was what created change and healing for them. Was beginning to see themselves with compassion as they learned about the effects of trauma. For the first time, their lives were making sense to them.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, in the United States, in the prisons, that people in prison have high, what they call adverse childhood experiences scores. So
Mm-hmm.
they have high incidence of having an incarcerated parent. They have high incidences of childhood abuse and neglect. They have high incidences of alcoholism and addiction in the home. And all of those things come together and create a greater possibility that people have to struggle with drug addiction, that people have to struggle with suicidality, that
Mhm.
people aren't rated themselves. So, um, so their interest and my interest converging in such a healing way was, I think, one of the first things that happened. And
Mhm.
I was in my 40s then.
Mhm.
And then at my 50th birthday party, I had a big 50th birthday party, and all my friends came, and there were 3 women there that I was sitting with, and they said, "You have to write a book." And I said, "I can't write a book. I've tried." And they said, "We will help you. We will dedicate a year. Each of us will take 1 week in rotation, meet with you for 1 hour, and make a transcript of what we talk about."
Mhm.
And they did. They met with me for a year, and they made transcripts, and that was the starting point. It actually took 5 more years for me to get the book published, and they were like, "I gave you a year, I'm done." But with the start that they had given me, I had material I could work with to try to bring this unruly mass of information about the brain into a coherent, user-friendly, non-scientist friendly way to look at the neuroscience of self-compassion.
Wow, that's wonderful. And is the book that you published, your first book, the one that we are discussing, or is another book?
It's the Your Resonant Self book, and you and I are now talking about the workbook.
Workbook. Okay.
But after I published the Your Resonant Self, I started teaching all over the world.
Mhm.
And wherever I would go, people would say, "All this is well and good, but I can't do it."
Mhm.
And I thought there must be a really good reason that people can't do it, a really good brain reason. And I started to think about trauma and about the way that not only do we store trauma memories, but we also store the agreements that we make with ourselves during
Mhm.
times of trauma. So I will never speak publicly again after a disastrous public speaking or, speaking and being humiliated by a first grade teacher. We're like, not talking again, not talking in public, not opening myself up to that. No.
Yeah.
Or we're rigidly controlled by a parent so that there's no time to breathe. We grow up and we find that we're always procrastinating or
Mhm.
we'll always be late in order to make a little bit of oxygen in a space that the oxygen has been sucked out of.
Mhm.
So those kinds of things, like if we, again, thinking about childhood trauma and my mother, if we go back to the roots of what people have had to deal with, then all of a sudden their self-sabotaging behaviors start to make perfect sense.
Mhm.
So the workbook is an invitation to go through all the different brain systems and to think about what kinds of agreements we have with ourselves that stop us from having our full access to life energy and warmth and joy and laughter and a sense of humor and all those fun things.
Wow, beautiful. And when we use the word workbook, I kind of imagine that there are exercises that I have to do myself. I mean, I read, I get some guidance, and then I do the exercises on my own.
Yes, you can
Mhm.
do them on your own. Many people have formed workbook groups
Okay.
where they make a little group of people and they start going through and they work together. There are
Mhm.
different kinds of it's I tried to make it fun and interesting. There are questionnaires, there are little games, there are also guided meditations that are available for free download on my website, yourresonantself.com. So there's a lot of different, and then there are examples of contracts and also transcripts of work that I've done with people who were discovering what were their contracts. I call these contracts unconscious contracts
Mhm.
because we know what we're doing. That part is conscious. I know I'm always late.
Mhm.
I know I can never start anything. I know I can never finish anything. I know those things, but I don't know my in order to. If I think about it, I think that it's just for me. Like, um, I will always eat chocolate in order to calm myself down.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think relationally. We don't think, I will eat chocolate in order to make myself calm so that my mother stays okay. And that deeper part that the workbook teaches us to find, that deeper part of going in just a little bit farther into the family system and starting to see the relationality of why we formed these agreements to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
This then allows people to find the unconscious part of the unconscious contract, which then makes it releasable. Because if we don't go deep enough, nothing changes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'm going to touch briefly on the chapters, and you're going to tell us a bit about some of the chapters and what you mentioned there, what you talk about there. And you talk about willing to like yourself in one of the chapters. I mean, tell us about liking ourselves and the willingness. Yeah.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. This points to a way that people will, that what happens for human brains is that human brains, when they're little, before the age of 9, if something bad happens, they blame themselves.
Mhm.
That's just what human brains do. That's how they're structured. It's
Mhm.
like the little child's brain doesn't have the capacity to go, oh, my mom has a mental illness. That's why everything's all messed up. The
Mhm.
little one instead says, oh, there must be something really wrong with me because my mom is unhappy with me all the time. And so that's it, becomes an agreement. I will not like myself. I will not be warm with myself. I will turn away from myself. I will punish myself. I will feel self-loathing. I will relentlessly criticize myself. All of these things come from that experience of being in a child's brain and having bad things happen and blaming ourselves. So we
Mhm.
grow up thinking, oh, it's just truth. It's just truth that I'm a bad person.
Mhm.
And then if we pick up the workbook, we can go, oh, I'm believing that I'm a bad person in order to support my family system,
Mhm.
in order to help my parents, in order to be the scapegoat, so that everybody has someone to blame. There are lots of things that people do that are difficult,
Yeah.
but accommodations to families trying to find their way with a heavy weight of trauma.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you for that. And you make us realize that is it's not truth, it's trauma, and
Yeah.
it happens to be a chapter that you've also mentioned. And talk about shame, because you
Mm.
mentioned, yeah, what is that shame? I mean, does shame come from blaming, or it's kind of, it's still the judgments and that we make upon ourselves?
Yes.
How do you
Yes.
explain that?
Well, for babies, again, coming back to babies,
Mm-hmm.
when babies express a bigger emotion than their parents can be with, if a
Mm-hmm.
baby has a really big smile and the mom has a littler smile, then the baby is receiving almost an electrical shock of feedback that they need to be smaller,
Mm-hmm.
that they need to smile less, that they need to laugh less, that they need to cry less, that however the mom responds, by the age of 4 months, the baby integrates what the mom can do and can't do emotionally and stays inside. Then we can tell from facial expressions. When
Mm-hmm.
babies are born, they have a full range of facial expressions, and as they are living in their family, they lose their full range of facial expressions because they're hitting into a kind of an invisible electric fence
Mm-hmm.
of culture. And that's the very first action of shame on
Mm-hmm.
babies,
Mm-hmm.
is a learning that happens way before language, that happens in terms of like, am I too much? Am I okay?
Mm-hmm.
And to turn the volume down. As they grow bigger and bigger, they'll get more different kinds of messages about being too much. Like, for example, that historic message that was given to most children in
Mm-hmm.
the century, which was children should be seen and not heard. I don't know if you heard that one when you were a little boy,
Yeah.
but yeah. But all over the world, that's what children were told in the 20th century and
Mm,
the 19th century as well, actually. But the so all of those kinds of messages are societal shame messages.
mm-hmm,
And we learn very well this invisible electric fence. And some people learn to stay away from it, and some people, depending on temperament, it really pisses them off, and they start to become very strident and insistent on actually existing. And that's a different kind of fight that happens for some people. And some people feel, the depending on temperament, again, our sensitivity to this electric fence,
mm-hmm,
there's a collapse that happens. And people can live with that collapse, again, thinking that it's truth rather than trauma, for their whole lives,
mm-hmm,
until they start to let go of some of these contracts. As they
mm,
start to let go of some of these contracts, people begin to be able to breathe.
mm. Now, I come to think that, and as you are putting it, these contracts that we made with ourselves, that most of what we are is what we've been made to be, and not what we ought to be.
Yes, or how we've tried to meet the world, I mean, almost like everybody will bring something different to the table, and
Yeah.
they'll come up against those invisible electric fences and react slightly differently. So not only how we've been made to be, but the creative, almost like thinking of it as the creativity of the self.
Okay.
Like, in a way, shame is a creative act.
Mm-hmm,
The contracts are creative acts that
mm-hmm.
we are meeting. It's like unmovable force meets unstoppable object, or whatever the
Okay.
phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, that we're clashing and finding creative ways to live with it. So our
Mm-hmm,
addictions are creative accommodations. Our self-sabotage is a creative accommodation. And that kind of helps with self-compassion as well.
mm. Now, that's a good time to hear today about creative, being creative in shame, being creative in things that limit myself. That's interesting, an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Hmm. And then we talk about something that could be not only been affecting people from the time that they were born and the way that they were growing, but experiences that we meet when we've fully grown. I mean, we experience some like the recent pandemic that has been happening, and
Yeah.
how do we deal with such sudden things, such unexpected occurrences in our own life? Not far-fetched things happening right now.
Right now, yeah. One of the things that I've noticed is that, um, in the beginning of the pandemic, people turned on their hypervigilance meters. I remember in the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't know how COVID was transmitted,
Mm-hmm.
and people closed themselves in entirely and had food delivered, and then they had to spray the bags with hydrogen peroxide. I mean, there was like a way that some people just shut completely down in
Mm-hmm.
order to try to survive against a microbe, a virus that we didn't know how it traveled. Did it travel on food packaging? Did it
Mm-hmm.
travel on mail? Did it, or was it this airborne transmission? And if it was airborne, was it droplets, or was it airborne? People became very vigilant, and almost made an agreement, a trauma-based agreement with themselves, to stay alert at all times. And
Mm-hmm.
many people haven't quite got their alert button turned off because they're still in a state of alarm about how to survive this
Mm-hmm.
time. And maybe not just the virus, but also the economic impact that's been happening all over the world. And
Mm-hmm.
now people, scientists, I was just looking this morning, and scientists are finding some evidence that the current economic threat of recession is harder, like the rising fuel prices, the rising food prices, the scarcity of food is even harder on people
Mm,
than the pandemic was. And so, the war in Ukraine and the way that that's impacting grain and crops, um, it's 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 hitting people hard. And when we're hit hard, we do tend to make these agreements. If we know that we're making them, then we can often like have warmth and softness about them, and they'll just kind of dissipate. We'll just go, oh, look at that. Look at that. I made a promise to myself to be vigilant every minute. I guess I don't have to do that anymore. I can let go of the tension in my shoulders
mm.
and have a moment to laugh every so often.
Yeah, yeah, so much is happening and at a terrific speed, and we don't know what is going to happen in the coming months. Right now, talking of the economic situation all over the world, and it's happening, and especially in Europe. Just a few days ago, I mean, the euro came at par with the dollar, and now
Yeah,
it's equal.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm,
It's
mhm,
stunning. Yeah.
mm. Then you point to the fact that we can find our path for those of us who may be in a depression. I mean, we are depressed because of what is happening. How is that the path out of depression? How is that?
The path out of depression is kind of a funny counterintuitive path.
Mm-hmm,
I um I love the work of Jaak Panksepp, who was an emotions researcher of the 20th century, who died about 4 years ago. And
mm-hmm,
I had his co-researcher on for an interview in my summit this year, and he was talking about how depression is um, metabolic exhaustion, that it is a way to try to cope with our hearts reaching for connection
mm-hmm,
and reaching for intimacy, reaching for relationship, and not having anyone come. That there's a collapse when no one comes. And it can be a really old collapse. That can be the collapse from being an infant and having nobody come, because then we become metabolically exhausted from crying.
mm-hmm,
Or it can be a present day collapse in COVID, for example, with the isolation that happened for many people, or the stoppage of global travel, which meant that some people were completely isolated from their families and couldn't be with them, and had family members die and they couldn't go to the funeral, those kinds of things are
mm-hmm,
part of what can be a present time metabolic exhaustion for adults. So, what we need more than anything else is self warmth, is to be able to turn towards the self and almost like gather up the body, in our imagination. If I were to turn towards depressed Sarah and gather her up and sort of feel her body, to feel her bones and her flesh in my arms, and to just like radiate warmth and love for that one who is metabolically exhausted.
mm-hmm,
it, it's really the very best starting point. It's a little tricky, because if we're metabolically exhausted, where do we find the part of ourselves that can gather us up, right?
mm-hmm,
But we can imagine other people who love us, who don't get to be with us right now, people who have died. We can call on our ancestors. When I was at my most depressed, it would be so hard to get out of bed, and I would say, ancestors, if you want me out of bed, you got to give me a push. And it was like calling on something outside of myself that allowed there to be a bit of a lift, that
mm-hmm.
then, allowed things to begin to move. So self warmth, it's very strange, but it's very effective. Self warmth, self warmth, self warmth. And in
Oh,
order to do it, we have to stop. One of the difficult symptoms of depression is rumination about the self being not good enough.
mm-hmm,
And so we do need to develop the skills that are in the books that are about being warm with the self. about, like, if I say to myself, Sarah, you idiot, I'm calling myself a name. There's research that shows that when children are called names, it hurts their brain. We can see visible scars in their brain from verbal abuse. I mean, something that simple is verbal abuse. You're stupid, you're fat, you're ugly, you're useless, you're an idiot. These are some of the things that happen inside of Sarah's brain. And if we begin to turn towards that voice also with warmth and say, voice that's calling Sarah an idiot, do you need some acknowledgement of helplessness, of a desire for things to go well, of an impatience? And as we begin to have that kind of dialogue, inner dialogue, we're counteracting the fierce and lacerating self-criticism that's
Mm-hmm.
a that's a part of the rumination of depression. So that also needs to be addressed, because it'll take us down all by itself without any pandemic or recession.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. For those who may be watching and also those who get to listen to the podcast on the podcast platforms that we upload to, we are talking to Sarah Peyton and discussing the workbook, Your Resonant Self. And we are very appreciative of the things that you've been sharing with us. And maybe can we know the other things apart from this book, because I know people are going to get the book, but apart from the book, what other things do you do? And you are going to tell us how people can connect with you if they want to reach you, how they can get to you.
Yes, if you want to begin to explore this material for free, just as a test to see whether you like it or not, the guided meditations are available for free download on yourresonantself.com.
Mm-hmm,
And sarahpayton.com has all of the recorded classes and live classes online right now. Everything's online right now because of the pandemic. And
mm-hmm,
and you can begin to explore this whole world, because part of what helps a lot is to begin to find practice partners and to practice together, to
mm-hmm,
practice being warm with each other together, and to practice how to respond to a complaint. And to know that there are different ways to use language that speak to the traumatized brain. And giving advice and telling people what to do or telling people to breathe, those things don't support a traumatized brain. But making a certain kind of jokes and asking about impossible dreams um, and uh, and making metaphor guesses and talking about body sensations, those things actually help a traumatized brain. So if you're interested in that kind of practice and exploration, there are a lot of classes on sarahpayton.com. And there's also a little book to start with that's called Affirmations for Turbulent Times. That's really sweet as well. That is just a taster menu for for people who are not into the heavy neuroscience. It's not heavy. I love it so much. I try to make it really light and interesting. But
wonderful. So for those of you who may want to connect with Sarah, go to sarahpayton.com, www.sarahpayton.com, and
yeah.
you get all that she's told you and much more. And I know you organize summits and things like that, workshops. You
Yes, yes, yes.
okay?
That we have a summit every year where we bring neuroscientists to speak
Okay,
about the latest research and that talks about self-compassion.
that's wonderful. So this has been Sarah Payton talking about your Resonant Self workbook. And we are almost through with the program. But before we go, we always ask our guests to leave us with a few words that we will always remember. This is your time, Sarah.
Oh, well, you already said my few words, the ones I love the most, but it's not truth, it's trauma. If your brain is being mean to you, it's not truth, it's just trauma, and it can be healed.
Wow. It's not truth, it's trauma, and it can be healed.
Yeah.
It's good to know that. So once again, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, all the viewers, all the listeners, and those who get to listen in the future. We thank you for tuning in. And has been your host, Anthony Morore, together with a guest, Sarah Peyton, and we are saying bye for now.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.